Our next speaker will be Dr. Jacqueline Kasun, who's going to speak to us about population control and the population situation in the world. Thank you.
It is a privilege to be here. Can you hear me? Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to the educational efforts of Vice President Al Gore, the United States Department of State, Ted Turner, Planned Parenthood, Paul Ehrlich, and the Sierra Club, we all know that overpopulation is the world's greatest problem. It is even worse than what Al Gore has called our, quote, environmental holocaust without precedent, end quote. That is the, quote, black hole, end quote, as he calls it, of global warming, deforestation, species extinction, and the acid rain, LR, and asbestos crises, not to mention the saccharine crisis, because it is the root cause of all these catastrophes, both actual and impending. I am well aware of my listeners' concerns with these dread portents, and I hope that I may be forgiven for interjecting a few facts into the discussion. It is easy to believe that the world is overpopulated because human beings have always lived in crowded conditions and do so at the present time. We do so not because of lack of space on the planet, but because of the need to work together, to buy and sell, to give and receive services from one another, to exchange goods and services. Our cities and towns have always thronged with people and traffic. Horses, donkeys, and camels in ages past, motor vehicles today. This accounts for the recurring theme throughout history of overpopulation. Plato and Aristotle worried about it half a millennium before Christ. Chinese cities were crowded centers for the exchange of products and ideas, and Confucius and other Chinese thinkers worried about excessive population growth. Because we crowd together and because the earth is large relative to our needs, we leave most of it unoccupied, as you can see when you fly over it. Human beings actually use less than 1 to 3% of the land area of the earth for their urban areas, roads, railroads, and airports, according to experts such as Julian Simon and others. And if you would like a copy of this talk with all the references, just let me know and I'll mail it to you. All the people of the world could move into the state of Texas and form a giant city with, yeah, who would want to? With about the same population density as some large cities today. It would be better than Arkansas. Nevertheless, since the Johnson administration of the 1960s, our government has promoted the belief that overpopulation threatens the planet and that the world's overriding need is for a reduction in births. Unless we accomplish this, we would soon be standing on each other's shoulders and multiplying at the speed of light, as shown in one familiar illustration. It is true that there was an unprecedented spurt in population growth during the 1960s and 1970s. This was the result of a decline in the world death rate rather than an increase in birth. The birth rate was actually declining, but deaths were declining even more rapidly as the new antibiotics and improved sanitation saved more people from disease. Accordingly, to save the world from the resulting plague of people, the Agency for International Development in the U.S. Department of State, egged on by the agency's supporters among non-governmental organizations, officially adopted a policy of promoting birth control. Congress therefore wrote a requirement into U.S. foreign aid law that countries receiving our foreign assistance must take steps to reduce the rate of growth of their populations, and that law is still in effect. I have a copy of the contract between Costa Rica and the U.S. Agency for International Development in the State Department. In it, the United States promised to pay $12 million to Costa Rica in return for Costa Rica's promise to reach a contraceptive prevalence rate of 70% by 1992, to reduce its crude death rate from 32 per thousand to 28 per thousand, and provide, quote, sex education in the schools and to the non-enrolled school age population, end quote. So, whether or not there is a school and whether or not the child can go to it, he will still get sex education. Most economists, including me, as well as many demographers, did not and do not believe that overpopulation is the cause of all evils. And neither did the Reagan administration. Its delegation to the Mexico City Conference on Population in 1984, in fact, said that the main cause of poverty and suffering is wrong economic policy and not overpopulation. However, by the time the administration said this, previous administrations had already poured billions of dollars into population control. And this had created a very large, well-financed and vocal special interest group ready to lobby hard for continued funds for Planned Parenthood and like-minded groups. This is the reason no government program can ever be abolished. In the meantime, birth rates continued to fall throughout the world. This would probably have happened even if there were no free pills and condoms provided by the United States, because the world was rapidly urbanizing and city women have fewer children. They do so because they need and get more education, and they marry later, and they work outside the home, which makes it harder to raise children than on the farm, where children begin to work at an early age to help with the animals and crops. Nevertheless, the Clinton-Gore administration continues to increase spending on birth control by tens of millions of dollars a year, both at home and abroad. The U.S. Bureau of the Census has jumped in to justify this by forecasting that the United States population will double by the end of the century. To my knowledge, no reputable statistical agency has ever before issued a 100-year population forecast. The people who will be having babies then will not even be born until 70 to 80 years from now. In order to make this colossal forecast, the Census Bureau simply assumed, without any basis in fact, that we will receive a flood of new immigrants and that our birth rate will rise and our death rate will decline. In fact, our birth rate has fallen from 24.3 per thousand population in 1950-55 to 14.6 in 1998. This falling trend is likely to continue for some time because the size of the female population of reproductive age will decline by several million during the next decade, unless this is offset by immigration. Also, the U.S. death rate has been rising slightly but perceptibly in recent decades because the population is aging. People have been living longer and death rates are higher among older populations. For example, the death rate in healthy but elderly Sweden is 11 per thousand, compared with 5 for youthful Mexico and 9 for our country. The median age of our population has risen from 28 years in 1970 to 35.6 in 1999. We are becoming more like Sweden. Popular discussions make much of our rising life expectancy, which is a worldwide fact, of course. But the death rate is still 100% sooner or later, and older populations have higher death rates, other things being equal. These trends are visible throughout the world. Population growth rates are declining, women are having fewer babies with each succeeding generation, populations are aging, death rates are rising, and 44% of the world's population lives in countries where birth rates are too low to prevent population decline. If present trends continue, there will be 100 million fewer people in Europe 50 years from now than there are today. There will be 21 million fewer in Japan. Worldwide, the average number of children per family is less than 3. This is also the average for Asia and Latin America. The one-child family is now typical in Europe, with 1.3 children now the average for Spain and 1.2 in Italy. The UN Population Division predicts that the world population growth rate will decline by 3/4 over the next 50 years to less than 0.4% per year. The division also predicts that world fertility will continue to decline while the death rate rises, that the proportion of children will fall while the proportion of persons over 60 will rise and exceed the proportion under 15, probably for the first time in history. Indeed, Nicholas Eberstadt, a demographer friend of mine, has drawn a vivid word picture of the world's future. Quote, "For the first time in the human experience, there could be societies in which the only biological relatives for many people, possibly most people, would be their ancestors," end quote. That is, most children would be without brothers, sisters, or cousins. I might add also that most people my age would be without grandchildren. The U.S. Census Bureau forecast of our future population differs remarkably from that of the United Nations Population Division, an equally respectable statistical agency. The UN forecast only goes up to the year 2050, when it forecasts 50 million fewer people for the United States than the census estimate. The reason lies in the assumptions, with the census assuming that annual immigration will rise to 1,450,000 annually by the year 2030, compared with a present flow of less than 1 million a year. The Census Bureau forecasts that in the absence of immigration, our population would grow by 40% rather than doubling by the end of this century. It is remarkable that the Census Bureau predicts that, contrary to present trends, fertility in the United States will increase and mortality will decline. It predicts that by the mid-century, American women will be having an average of 2.2 children per lifetime, compared with the present rate of 2.0, and the UN middle-level prediction of 1.9. The Census Bureau predicts that the rise in the death rate, already visible and predicted by the United Nations to continue, will reverse itself. Some of these effects will be the result of the assumed flood of immigrants who, especially if they are Hispanic, tend to be younger and to bear more children than natives. However, to assume that these differentials will persist after decades of Americanization is questionable. The Census Bureau's forecast came out at the same time the Clinton administration was sending its latest request to Congress for additional funds for its programs to control domestic and world population growth. Some people made the snide suggestion that the two events were related, but of course I would not suggest such a thing. The census forecast, of course, appeared on the front pages of the papers, as well as being featured on the evening news. Shortly thereafter, the UN Population Division made an announcement that received almost no media attention. It said, in part, quote, "In the next 50 years, the populations of most developed countries are projected to become smaller and older as a result of low fertility and increased longevity. Population decline is inevitable in the absence of replacement migration. The numbers of immigrants needed to prevent declines in the working age population are larger than those needed to prevent declines in total population. In some cases, such as the Republic of Korea, France, the United Kingdom, or the United States, they are several times larger. In the absence of immigration, the potential support ratios, that is, the ratio of working to dependent populations, could be maintained at current levels by increasing the upper limit of the working age population to roughly 75 years of age. The new challenges of declining and aging populations will require a comprehensive reassessment of many established policies and programs." End quote. The report estimates that the United States, in order to prevent population decline, would need fewer immigrants than we now receive. We now receive about 800,000 to 900,000 per year. But that we would need almost 12 million immigrants annually to maintain our present support ratio of working to dependent populations. Currently, the United States is directly spending more than $1 billion a year on each of domestic and foreign population control, referred to in the budgets as family planning and sustainable development and population assistance. And each year, the Clinton-Gore administration asks for tens of millions of dollars more. This does not include the leverage effect of tying our entire foreign aid program to the requirement for population control. Both the domestic and foreign programs have employed some extremely persuasive methods to achieve their objectives. Before I tell you some of the horror stories, you need to understand something about the economic incentives built into government programs. In order to get people to do whatever it is that the government wants them to do, rather than just take the money and run, the government has to provide some incentives. And so, when the government pays Planned Parenthood to do birth control, either in this country or abroad, the workers in the local agencies receive their pay in accordance with their output of Depo-Provera injections, implants of Norplant, sterilizations, and pills and condoms dispensed. This gives the family planning workers an incentive to work hard to do birth control. During the 1970s in this country, college professors were not only inciting their students to protest the war, they were having them read Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, warning them of the mass starvation and chaos to come as the result of overpopulation. And Planned Parenthood was all over the campuses, including my campus, advertising sterilizations at special cut rates. The young men responded by the thousands. In foreign countries, where the idealism of the young does not lead them to get themselves sterilized, there was a different approach. In Bangladesh, 53,000 family planning workers go door to door to promote birth control. The government, using United States grants, pays people who accept long-term contraception and sterilization, as well as those who sterilize them and those who recruit them for the operation. The Bangladesh papers, which I read for several years, reported that people accepting birth control reported, quote, coercion, blackmail, and abuse of payment provisions, end quote. The Bangladesh Health Secretary acknowledged that these were indeed problems. While I was at the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in 1994, I met a dynamic and attractive young woman, Farida Akhtar, from Bangladesh. She appears in a British documentary film, The Human Laboratory, which shows badly disabled Bangladeshi women who claim that the foreign doctors who inserted birth control devices in them refused to remove them when they had problems. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh was unable to attend the Cairo conference because her people were rioting in the streets against population control financed by foreign aid. Newspapers in Bangladesh reported that the unwanted condoms and pills were piling up in warehouses. The average number of children a Bangladeshi woman has during her lifetime has fallen from 7 in 1970 to 3 at present. In Indonesia, the U.S. Agency for International Development sponsored the village system of population control in 30,000 villages. The monthly village meeting would begin with a roll call in which each man would report whether he and his wife were using contraceptives. The replies were plotted on a prominently displayed map of the village so that all the villagers could easily see which of their acquaintances were helping or hurting the village's chance of winning the group reward for birth control. Several women came from Mexico to the United States in 1997 to report that they had had intrauterine devices inserted into them by force under a program in which Mexico would receive aid from the International Monetary Fund, which is financed by the United States. The Fujimori government of Peru operated a quota system for coerced sterilizations, which resulted in a number of deaths. The U.S. Agency for International Development, under pressure from Congress, announced that it was withdrawing its funds, but the reports continue. The brutal one-child program of forced abortions and forced sterilizations in China has for years operated with intermittent indirect funding by the United States. At one of my presentations recently, a member of the audience asked what would happen if these programs were abolished to that little starving girl whose picture appears so often on television to remind us of the terrible costs of overpopulation. For the answer, I referred my questioner to Ethiopia, where the Marxist government set out to socialize the farming sector, which had supported the Ethiopian population and provided food for export for centuries. Traditionally, private traders had bought farm surpluses in good years, stored and then sold them in years of drought, transporting them by donkey trains. This system was invented by the biblical Joseph in the service of Pharaoh. It enabled the country to endure centuries marked by cycles of rain and drought. Determined to stamp out private trade, the Marxist government seized the traders' stores of grain and exported them to the Soviet Union for arms. The government also seized the traders' animals, which then perished because no one was interested in caring for a socialized donkey. When the inevitable drought arrived and crops failed, as they always do intermittently in Ethiopia, there were no buffer stocks to feed the hungry and no means for transporting and distributing the food aid that arrived from abroad. They had donkey trails, not freeways for trucks, and they had no trucks either. The Civil War, which began in 1960 and persisted through the early 1990s, added to the horrors. American broadcasters, of course, reported and displayed it all as the result of overpopulation. Ethiopia is now at war again, this time with its former ally, Eritrea. And once again, the starving children appear on American television, reminding us of the alleged need for birth control. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Africa and in India, Mexico, and China, the governments appointed themselves as chief buyers of food, paying less than cost for food to subsidize politically active consumers living in the cities. This policy drove farmers into poverty, resulting in insufficient harvests and ultimately hunger and even famine. It triggered an exodus of destitute farmers who abandoned their fields and sought their fortunes in the cities whenever they were permitted to do so. Not surprisingly, when the governments increased payments to farmers, food production increased. Often the government subsidized factories that were headed by those with close political ties to the parties in power. At the same time, the governments continued to strangle private business with taxes and licensing requirements, even as they restricted private trade. In short, the governments manipulated their economies and their foreign aid to the advantage of a few elite and the disadvantage and misery of the many poor. Wherever and whenever governments abandoned these destructive policies, even in part, and allowed even partially free rein to their people's productivity, as has happened recently in Mexico and China, hunger disappeared and abundance flourished. The spokesman for Zambia brought it all together for me at the Cairo conference. He said that freer trade would be 10 times as beneficial to the poor countries as foreign aid. And he was right, of course. The aid goes to their elites, who spend it on their wars and their Swiss castles. Foreign aid is a transfer from the poor of the rich countries to the rich of the poor countries. Freer trade would enable their poor people to earn their way out of poverty and would bring us more and cheaper consumption goods. Freer trade with Mexico has brought prosperity to the United States as well as more jobs and is turning Mexico into a new economic tiger. And their families can decide for themselves how many children to have. Thank you.
I'm Bob Chiak. I heard from Steve Mosher of the Population Research Institute that the people that he brought up from Peru to testify to Congress resulted in a significant decrease in funding of some of these programs. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I don't know how much the funding has decreased, but as I said in my talk, the Clinton administration is continually asking for more funds, and the total expenditure is going up by tens of millions of dollars annually. There may have been some cutoff of funds specifically to Peru. However, the reports of Peruvian abuses have continued, and the requirement remains in our foreign assistance law that countries receiving our foreign aid must take steps to reduce the growth of their populations.
Thank you.
Dr. Kasun, would you like to comment on the extent and the demographic consequences of the policy of selective abortion of female babies or female infanticide?
Yes, and I'm sorry I don't have the specific figures here in my briefcase. However, I have looked them up, and I have in fact written about them in some of my articles. There is now a worldwide deficit of millions upon millions of women. And this is contrary to the usual demographic expectation, because women generally outnumber men. More male babies are born, but the male death rate exceeds that of females, so that we generally expect the women to outnumber the men by the time early adulthood is reached. And this is not the case in China and many other countries, I believe also India, as well as many other countries where selective abortion of girls has taken place. The reason for this in China, of course, is that culturally the boy is expected to support his parents. So when the family is restricted to just one child, they try to make sure that that one child is a boy who will grow to be a man and support his parents, rather than a woman who will go and serve her in-laws. And so not only is there selective abortion of girls in China, there is widespread abandonment of female babies.
I keep hearing rumors that in certain parts of the world, particularly in Africa, the AIDS effect is such as to eliminate the childbearing age group of the population. Is that actually occurring, or is this something that I just heard?
It is certainly offsetting it. I don't know whether it is offsetting it totally. Again, I don't have those figures at my fingertips. However, Africa is very far from being overpopulated. It has about 1/4 to 1/5 the population density of Europe, and has less than 1 billion people altogether out of a world total of 6 billion. So our concerns about African overpopulation, even though there is a relatively high birth rate in many countries, they also have a relatively high death rate. But according to UN figures, the African population is still increasing. How long that will continue, I don't know.